November 1943. At a secret Luftwaffe testing ground deep in the forests near Rechlin, the heavy steel doors of Hangar 7 groaned open, revealing a shape none of the German pilots had ever seen before. Sunlight struck the dull olive-green fuselage of a captured American fighter, its frame broad and barrel-chested, its wings too short for its body, its nose thick as an engine block. A chorus of laughter rippled through the crowd of officers and engineers. "Look at that thing," one shouted. "Too fat to fly, too slow to fight." Another smirked. The Americans build refrigerators with wings. They called it the Fliegendes Milchfass, the flying milk can. It was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and beside it stood its captured pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hayes of the U.S. Army Air Forces, his uniform torn, his expression calm in the face of mockery. Hayes had been forced down after a navigation error during a bomber escort over northern France. His plane, miraculously intact, had been dragged here as a trophy. Among the spectators was Captain Henry Lawson, a tall, quiet Luftwaffe test pilot with a reputation for precision and restraint. While his comrades jeered, Lawson studied the aircraft through a haze of exhaust and cigarette smoke. He noted the sheer size of its propeller, the thickness of its landing gear, the unfamiliar complexity of the turbocharger ducts that ran like veins across its rear fuselage. It looked nothing like the sleek, knife-edged fighters Germany prized, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the Focke-Wulf 190. This thing was brute force shaped into flight. "What do you think, Henry?" one mechanic asked, still laughing. Lawson's eyes stayed fixed on the American plane. "I think," he said slowly, "I'll see how it flies before I laugh." His voice carried little weight that day. The Luftwaffe officers nearby were still drunk on victories past. To them, the air war belonged to Germany. 2 years earlier, their fighters had swept the skies from the North Sea to the Volga. Even now, with the Allies growing stronger, the German command believed skill and engineering superiority would hold. They measured victory by the grace of design, not by numbers. The P-47 seemed to mock that philosophy. Everything about it was overbuilt. It weighed nearly 7 tons loaded, twice that of the agile Bf 109. Its wings were thick enough to walk on. Its radial engine was as wide as a man's chest was tall. To the engineers of precision, it was a clumsy brute. Yet when Lawson climbed the ladder to inspect the cockpit, his laughter died before it began. The seat was broad and comfortable, the dials labeled in simple English, color-coded for clarity, green for safe, yellow for caution, red for danger. Every switch was reachable with a gloved hand. The canopy offered a panoramic view, unobstructed by armor plates or rivets. It was, Lawson realized, built for the ordinary pilot, not the ace. "Strange," he murmured, tracing a finger along the throttle quadrant. "They built it for men, not machines." Behind him, Hayes was escorted away under guard, his wrists bound, but his chin lifted. As he passed, Lawson turned to him. "You flew this across the channel?" Hayes smiled faintly. "Flew it, fought in it, landed it in one piece. Not bad for a flying milk can." Lawson said nothing more, but the words followed him into the hangar's silence long after the laughter faded. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, he wrote in his logbook, "Aircraft, Republic P-47C, captured. Appearance crude, design curious. Will fly tomorrow for evaluation. Initial impression, more logic than beauty." Beyond the airfield, the thunder of distant guns rolled from the Western Front, where Allied bombers were beginning to strike deeper into occupied Europe. The war in the air was changing, though few inside Germany would admit it. The Luftwaffe still trained its pilots to duel like knights, but the enemy they mocked was building something different. A system, not a single sword. Lawson didn't know it yet, But that machine sitting quietly under the floodlights represented not just American engineering, but an entire way of thinking. That victory could be manufactured. And somewhere in the barracks, the captured Lieutenant Hayes was whispering to a guard in halting German, "You can laugh all you want, but that thing, it always comes home." Outside, the November wind carried the faint smell of oil and frost. Mechanics worked through the night, draining fuel, checking hydraulics, preparing the Thunderbolt for its first German flight. Lawson stood alone at the edge of the runway, watching the silhouette of the aircraft under the searchlights. It looked less like a fighter and more like a sleeping animal, silent, heavy, waiting. He adjusted his gloves and said quietly to himself, "Tomorrow, we'll see if it deserves the laughter or the fear." The next morning, as dawn burned through the mist and the engines roared to life, Captain Henry Lawson climbed into the cockpit of the fat American fighter. The propeller spun, the ground shook, and with a deep metallic growl, the Thunderbolt began to roll. And as he pushed the throttle forward for the first time, the laughter that had filled the hangar began to fade. The P-47's massive propeller carved through the morning mist, sending dust swirling across the Rechlin airfield. Captain Henry Lawson gripped the control column, his gloved hand steady, his heartbeat matching the deep rhythmic growl of the Pratt Whitney engine ahead of him. The heavy machine surged forward with an urgency that defied its bulk. Within seconds, the flying milk can left the ground, climbing slowly but surely into the pale November sky. The sensation was unlike any aircraft Lawson had flown. German fighters were nervous, twitching things, alive under the fingertips, demanding constant attention. This one was calm, deliberate, a machine that carried him rather than obeyed him. He leveled off at 5,000 feet, the clouds rolling beneath him like a white sea, and eased the throttle higher. The roar deepened but remained smooth, each revolution of the massive radial engine pulsing through the frame like a steady heartbeat. He banked gently, surprised by the balance. It was heavy, yes, but it moved with confidence, not clumsiness. Lawson tested a dive, pulling the stick forward and watching the airspeed climb past 400 miles per hour. The controls stiffened, but the aircraft held its line, slicing through the air like a falling hammer. He pulled out, feeling the wings strain, but the frame didn't tremble. For the first time, he felt respect, an involuntary recognition that beneath the crude shape was discipline, not chaos. Back on the ground, the mechanics gathered around as Lawson taxied to a halt. The canopy slid open, and his first words were not what anyone expected. "It flies," he said simply. "It shouldn't, but it does." Later, in the officer's briefing room, he spread his notes across a long oak table. "Look here," he told the engineers, tracing the lines of the fuselage on the captured blueprint. "It's built like a tractor, strong where it needs to be, simple where it can be. No elegance, but every part makes sense." He pointed to the cockpit diagram, its color-coded dials and wide layout. Any pilot could climb in and fly. No manuals, no special training. Red means danger, green means safe. It's the first cockpit designed for clarity, not prestige. One engineer scoffed. "That's barbaric simplicity," Lawson corrected him softly. "That's reliability." He explained how the thick wings held the heavy fuel tanks and 8 machine guns without flexing, how the wide landing gear made takeoff almost foolproof. "You could land this thing in a field," he added, "and it would take off again tomorrow." Around the room, the laughter was quieter now. Some scribbled notes, others exchanged glances. The Luftwaffe had spent years chasing the ideal of perfection, speed, agility, the pilot as hero. But Lawson saw something different in the American philosophy: endurance, practicality, and the belief that a good enough machine in the hands of many could beat a perfect one in the hands of few. That night, unable to sleep, he walked alone back to the hangar. The Thunderbolt loomed under the floodlights, its skin glinting with oil and frost. He ran his hand along the metal flank and whispered to himself, "Not a beauty queen, a worker." Inside, the smell of fuel and steel mixed with the quiet ticking of cooling metal. He opened the engine cowling and stared at the massive turbo supercharger lines that curved through the fuselage like arteries. It was over-engineered to the extreme, yet somehow logical, designed to deliver full power at heights where most engines gasped for air. They build engines that breathe for themselves, he thought. He remembered the American pilot, Robert Hayes, who had said with quiet pride, "You can laugh, but it always comes home." Lawson was beginning to understand what that meant. The next morning, he delivered his report to the base commander, a stern colonel who still believed Germany owned the skies. Lawson summarized calmly, "The Thunderbolt is not fast to climb, nor graceful to maneuver, but it is stable, forgiving, and built to survive. It favors the pilot, not the mechanic. In prolonged war, that matters more than elegance." The colonel frowned. "You sound impressed," Lawson replied. "Impressed by their philosophy, not their art." The colonel dismissed him with a wave. "We'll keep winning with ours." Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of distant engines, the sound of another Allied bombing raid crossing the Rhine. Lawson looked toward the horizon and wondered how many more of those ugly machines were being built at that very moment, thousands of miles away. Each one a reflection of a factory that never slept. As he walked back toward the hangar, the sunrise caught the Thunderbolt's canopy, casting a glare like liquid fire. For a brief moment, the plane looked alive, as if aware of the doubt it had just planted in its observer. Lawson stopped, the corners of his mouth tightening. "Perhaps we've been chasing the wrong kind of perfection," he murmured. The hangar echoed with the clang of tools and the murmur of mechanics preparing the next tests. Tomorrow, he would take the Thunderbolt higher, into the cold, thin air where most engines choked and most pilots hesitated. And as the light faded from the airfield, Lawson knew that what he had seen so far was only the surface. The real secret of the American fighter was waiting above the clouds. The next morning, frost clung to the grass around the runway, and the air over Rechlin shimmered with cold light. Mechanics cleared the last chocks from under the wheels as Captain Henry Lawson pulled his goggles into place. This flight would go higher than any test he had attempted with the P-47 before. He eased the throttle forward, and the massive radial engine came alive with a steady, confident thunder. The aircraft rolled forward, then lifted with an unexpected grace, climbing into the pale November sky. At 5,000 feet, the fields below blurred into a patchwork of white and brown. At 10,000, the engine still roared with the same even pulse. At 20,000, most German fighters would begin to lose power, but this one did not. The needle on the manifold pressure gauge held steady. The turbo supercharger was doing its work, feeding oxygen to the cylinders as if the aircraft were still at sea level. Lawson felt the lift under the wings, the stability through his controls, and the strange calm of a machine that refused to struggle against the thin air. He leveled off at 25,000 feet, surrounded by a sea of clouds stretching to the horizon. "You shouldn't even be up here," he muttered, "and yet you climb like you're made for it." He banked left and pushed into a dive, watching the airspeed indicator climb, 300, 400, 450. The frame vibrated slightly, but held true, no shudder, no compression stall. When he pulled out of the dive, the aircraft responded with effortless strength, rolling level again, as if nothing had happened. Lawson realized then that this was not a fragile masterpiece like the ones he had known. It was a tank disguised as a fighter, built not for elegance but for endurance. When he landed, the other test pilots gathered around, waiting for him to confirm what they already assumed, that the plane was a flying joke. Instead, Lawson simply said, "It's not fast, it's not pretty, but it doesn't care. It keeps flying. Later that day, he wrote his report. In careful handwriting, he described the Thunderbolt's behavior at altitude, its stability, its forgiving nature. Where our machines punish mistakes, he wrote, this one forgives them. Germany builds perfection once. America builds it 1,000 times. He did not realize that those words would never be read beyond Rechlin. When the report reached Berlin, it was buried in a stack of technical assessments, dismissed as irrelevant. The generals still believed in the myth of the individual ace, of duels fought by willpower and precision. They saw no need to understand a philosophy that measured victory in mass, not artistry. Days later, Lawson stood in the observation tower watching the sky to the west. The sound of engines came faint, but growing, a low, continuous rumble like distant thunder. He lifted a pair of field glasses and saw the dark dots of Allied bombers crossing the horizon, flanked by specks of silver. Even from miles away, he could tell the shape, broad wings, thick fuselage, the same defiant outline that had once made his comrades laugh. The Americans were coming again, and this time their flying milk cans were climbing higher than any interceptors Germany could send. In the barracks that night, Lawson found Lieutenant Hayes again, still under guard but permitted limited work duties. The American smiled when he saw the pilot. "You've flown her now, haven't you?" Lawson nodded slowly. "I have. It's unlike anything we build." Hayes leaned closer. "We built it for boys who'd never flown before. They needed a plane that could save them from their own mistakes." Lawson looked at him for a long moment. "That's a dangerous kind of mercy in war." Hayes shook his head. "Not mercy, just understanding what war really costs." The words stayed with him. The next week he flew again, this time to test the limits of the Thunderbolt's endurance. For nearly 2 hours he kept it climbing, diving, rolling, firing the 8 heavy guns into the open air, feeling their recoil echo through the frame. The ammunition counters ticked down slowly, far longer than any German fighter could sustain. When he landed, his hands trembled, not from fear, but from awe. The plane was more than a machine. It was an idea made of steel. In the weeks that followed, the war in the air changed. Reports came from France and Belgium of American fighters that wouldn't die. Planes limping home with engines shredded, wings full of holes, pilots safe inside their armored shells. Victory. The Thunderbolt, once mocked as a flying refrigerator, was earning a new reputation among German crews. The tank that flew. Lawson began to sense what that meant for his country. A machine like this, built by the thousands, could not be stopped by tactics or bravery. It was the product of something deeper, a system that treated production as strategy. One evening, he stood by the airfield fence as bombers passed overhead toward Berlin, their contrails weaving white scars across the stars. Each one, he knew, was guarded by fighters like the one in his hangar. And in that moment, he understood what his report had failed to explain. The Americans weren't fighting just with pilots or engines. They were fighting with factories. "They're building victory," he whispered. Behind him, the thunder of engines faded into the distance, replaced by the far-off sound of anti-aircraft fire. The sky flickered, then went dark again. In the silence that followed, Lawson closed his notebook and stared toward the west, toward the sound of war he could no longer ignore. The laughter from months before was gone, replaced by an unease he couldn't shake. Somewhere in his mind, a question formed, one that would haunt him long after the war. What happens when a nation learns to mass-produce survival? That question found its answer months later, high above the French countryside. It was June 1943 when the Luftwaffe first faced the full force of the Thunderbolt squadrons. At dawn, the skies over northern France glowed silver as waves of American bombers lumbered eastward, escorted by the fighters Germany once called flying refrigerators. From the ground, they looked slow, clumsy, too heavy for battle. But to the pilots who met them in combat, they were something else entirely. Captain Henry Lawson wasn't there that morning, but the reports from the front reached Rechlin within hours. Pilots from Jagdgeschwader 26 described their shock, how the P-47s dove from impossible heights, guns blazing in lines of fire so dense it seemed the air itself had turned to metal. 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, each firing nearly 800 rounds a minute, created a storm no fighter could pass through unscathed. German formations broke apart under that weight. Their aircraft shredded in seconds. Those who survived said it felt like flying into a thunderclap. Lawson listened in silence as the intelligence officer read the combat reports. He imagined the chaos above the clouds, the crack of gunfire, the sight of metal tearing apart. In one report, a captured American pilot had written a single line: "We don't duel, we overwhelm." For Lawson, it explained everything. The Americans were not trying to outfly their enemies. They were trying to erase them through volume, precision, and consistency, the same principles that defined their factories. The most astonishing story came weeks later. A single Thunderbolt returned from a mission over France, riddled with more than 200 bullet holes, its canopy shattered, the pilot bleeding from shrapnel. Yet the aircraft landed safely. Mechanics counted the holes, then stopped when they reached 212. The radial engine still turned, the hydraulics still functioned. The pilot, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, stepped out alive. "That's not an airplane," one German observer muttered. "That's a tank with wings." Within months, that nickname, the flying tank, spread quietly among German squadrons. It was spoken with reluctant admiration. Pilots who had once mocked the P-47 now studied its silhouette with unease. They knew the thick wings hid not just fuel and guns, but something else, a terrifying patience. In the air, the Thunderbolt could not match the turn of a Messerschmitt or the climb of a Focke-Wulf, but in a dive it became unstoppable. German pilots learned the hard way that chasing a P-47 downward was suicide. It would simply pull away and then rise again, its guns roaring on the return. Lawson began to receive more captured data from the front: gun camera footage, ammunition logs, pilot debriefs. Each told the same story. The Thunderbolt's 8-gun battery wasn't just firepower, it was a philosophy. The Americans had engineered precision into chaos, turning the randomness of air combat into something mechanical, almost industrial. The convergence pattern of those guns, set at 300 yards, produced a cone of destruction that could disintegrate an enemy aircraft in 2 seconds. Lawson read the reports late at night in his quarters. He imagined the scene from the German perspective: a burst of light, a roar that drowned thought, a fighter vanishing into fragments before a man could even react. This isn't a duel, he thought. It's manufacturing in the sky. As the months passed, the pattern became clear. The more the Americans flew, the more efficient they became. Each squadron of Thunderbolts flew hundreds of missions, and the kill reports grew like a production chart. When he compared it to German records, Lawson saw the curve invert, the Luftwaffe losing altitude, the Americans rising. Yet inside the German command, the myth of superiority persisted. Orders continued to praise the spirit of the ace. It was a phrase that now felt hollow. The war was no longer about individual mastery. It was about who could sustain the grind. In October, a film reel arrived from occupied France, captured by ground units. It showed the aftermath of a battle: twisted wreckage of German fighters, bullet holes punched clean through armor, trees cut down by machine gun fire. The narrator's voice on the American footage was calm, factual. "Target neutralized. Returning to base." Lawson replayed that line in his head. No excitement, no triumph, just procedure. To them, destruction had become routine. That night, he returned once more to the hangar where the captured Thunderbolt stood in silence, its olive paint faded by months of testing. He sat beside it and listened to the wind scrape across the fuselage. The same wind, he realized, now carried across Europe, filled with the hum of thousands of these machines. In the distance, faint rumbles echoed from the western horizon, the sound of another raid, another thunderstorm of steel. He closed his eyes and thought of Hayes, the American pilot who had said, "It always comes home." Perhaps that was the most dangerous thing about it. Not its speed, not its guns, but its refusal to die. When he finally opened his eyes, dawn was breaking. The world outside glowed with the cold blue of early morning. The Thunderbolt's shadow stretched long across the hangar floor, reaching toward the east, the direction of Berlin. Lawson stood and whispered, "If this is what they call ugly, then perhaps beauty no longer matters." The war was moving into a new phase, one where art and skill meant little against the rhythm of mass and endurance. Soon, he would be asked to explain why the Luftwaffe could no longer stop them. And as he stared out over the frozen airfield, he knew that question would have no simple answer. The truth was not hidden in tactics or bravery, but in something far larger. Something forged not in hangars or airfields, but in the endless hum of factories across the ocean. In early 1944, Captain Henry Lawson was summoned to Berlin. The meeting was held inside a cold, smoke-filled conference room lined with maps and photographs. Across from him sat senior officers of the Air Ministry, their faces drawn, their voices sharp with disbelief. Losses were rising, fuel was vanishing, and Allied bombers were striking deeper every week. "You've flown their aircraft," one general said. "Explain it to us. Why can't we stop them?" Lawson hesitated, knowing what they wanted to hear. Excuses, perhaps even hope. But what he had seen in the captured Thunderbolt, and in the reports flooding from the front, could not be softened. "We are fighting men with factories," he said quietly. "Not factories with men." The room fell silent. Outside, the steady rumble of distant bombing reached even here, a reminder that the war was turning against them. In his notebook, Lawson later described the look on the general's face. Not anger, but exhaustion. "They could not understand," he wrote, "that the enemy's strength was not a single machine but the process that built it." By the spring of 1944, that process had become unstoppable. In Detroit, Indiana, and New York, assembly lines produced aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. At Republic Aviation's plant on Long Island, a new P-47 rolled off the line every hour. In Evansville, Indiana, men and women who had never seen Europe built 500 of them each month. Each machine contained 65,000 parts and 8 miles of wiring. Yet somehow they flowed from factory to runway with clockwork precision. To Germany's war planners, such numbers were incomprehensible. To Lawson, they were terrifying. He saw the contrast every day. In Rechlin, mechanics salvaged parts from wrecks just to keep their test aircraft flying. In America, a damaged Thunderbolt could be replaced overnight. The imbalance was no longer one of skill, but of time itself. While German engineers obsessed over refinements and prototypes, the Americans focused on repetition and reliability. The result was a tide of metal that no amount of talent could hold back. Reports from the front grew darker. Luftwaffe units once proud and invincible now flew with half-trained replacements. New pilots arrived with less than 100 flight hours, facing enemies who had twice that before even seeing combat. In contrast, American training fields turned out 30,000 pilots a year, each with over 400 hours in the air. They practiced formation flying, gunnery, and survival as part of a machine that never rested. For every German pilot lost, another gap opened that would never close. Lawson began to feel the weight of inevitability. He read the numbers and knew they told a story more powerful than any battle report. The P-47 was no longer just a weapon. It was the symbol of a country that had learned how to industrialize determination. Even its ammunition told that story. Each mission consumed thousands of .50 caliber rounds, every cartridge identical, flawless, interchangeable. Factories like Lake City Arsenal produced them by the millions. Their output measured not in boxes, but in tons. It was warfare measured in units per hour. One evening, as the War Council dragged into its fourth hour, a senior colonel slammed his fist on the table. "Precision will win," he barked. "We build the best aircraft in the world." Lawson met his gaze. "Precision cannot win against persistence," he said. The words earned him silence again, but no rebuttal. In the months that followed, his prediction played out in the skies. The Thunderbolt squadrons swarmed over occupied Europe in relentless waves. Every time one fell, another took its place. The sound of those engines became constant, an industrial rhythm that never ceased. To the men below, it was not the sound of flight, but of inevitability. In one report from Normandy, a German infantryman described looking up to see hundreds of P-47s diving in pairs, their guns cutting through convoys and rail lines. "They came like workers," he wrote. "Not heroes, not killers. Just workers who never stopped." Lawson clipped that line into his journal. It captured perfectly what he had come to understand. The Americans had built a war that no longer depended on brilliance. They had turned effort itself into a weapon. When his own superiors asked how to counter it, Lawson had no answer. You cannot outfly a system that never tires. You can only endure it until you collapse. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe's reserves were gone. Planes stood idle for lack of fuel. The skies once ruled by eagles now belonged to thunder. On the first day of the new year, Germany launched one final gamble, Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise strike meant to cripple Allied air power in one swift blow. To many, it was a last breath of defiance. To Lawson, it was desperation made visible. As he left Berlin for Rechlin that night, he looked west, where flashes on the horizon marked another bombing raid. The sound of engines rolled over the frozen landscape like a drumbeat. They will answer our last attack, he thought. And when they do, the sky will break. That answer came sooner than anyone in Berlin imagined. On the morning of January 1st, 1945, the new year began not with celebration, but with fire. The Luftwaffe launched its final desperate gamble, Operation Bodenplatte. Nearly 900 German fighters rose through the fog to strike Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. To many pilots, it felt like one last chance to prove that skill and courage could still change the outcome of the war. But the sky they entered no longer belonged to them. As Lawson watched from the edge of the runway, the horizon erupted with flashes. The American response came with terrifying speed. Within minutes, squadrons of Thunderbolts appeared, their engines thundering across the cold air, their 8 guns burning lines of fire through the mist. To the men below, it was as if a storm had descended, mechanical, deafening, without pause or mercy. Lawson could see the pattern even before the reports arrived. The Luftwaffe's best had thrown everything into the air, and it was being torn apart before noon. When the smoke cleared, the numbers told the truth no rhetoric could hide. Germany had lost hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable pilots in a single morning. The Americans had lost a handful, and by the next day, their hangars were full again. From Rechlin, Lawson could hear the distant rumble of transport trains carrying new planes to the front. Factories in Detroit and Evansville had already replaced what was destroyed. The machine kept moving. For the Luftwaffe, the war in the air was over. For Lawson, something inside him ended too. He no longer saw the Thunderbolt as a curiosity, or even as an enemy. It had become a symbol of a world he no longer understood. A world where strength was measured not by brilliance or bravery, but by the ability to build without end. In the final weeks of the war, he recorded his last flight log. The handwriting was slow, deliberate, almost resigned. "The Thunder has won," he wrote. "Not by speed, not by elegance, but by endurance. It carries the spirit of a nation that never stops." In April, when Germany fell silent, Lawson surrendered to Allied forces. He was interrogated briefly, then released into a camp for officers near Bremen. There, among the ruins, he met once more the man whose machine had changed everything, Lieutenant Robert Hayes. Time had aged them both, but the recognition was instant. Hayes smiled faintly. "I told you it always comes home." Lawson nodded, and we laughed when it arrived. They stood together watching a squadron of Thunderbolts roar overhead on their way east, the sun glinting off their silver wings. For the first time, Lawson smiled, not in irony, but in respect. "You built the sky," he said quietly. "No," Hayes replied. "We built the hands that could hold it." Decades passed. The world rebuilt itself, and the machines of war became relics behind museum glass. In 1980, in the warmth of an Arizona afternoon, a veterans' reunion brought former enemies together. Lawson, now an old man with unsteady hands, walked slowly through an exhibit hall until he stopped before a familiar silhouette. There it was again. The same wide fuselage, the same thick wings, polished now to a mirror shine. A placard read, "Republic P-47D, Miss Liberty." Beneath it, a line of small brass letters caught the light.
Thank you.
The laughter died. The thunder remained. Lawson reached out, his palm resting against the cool metal. Around him, visitors moved quietly, unaware of the man who once mocked this very aircraft. He spoke to no one in particular, his voice low but firm. "We called it a refrigerator with wings," he said. "We didn't know we were looking at the future." A museum guide nearby turned, startled, but Lawson continued, his gaze lost in memory. "They built 15,000 of these, Tom," he said. 15,000, each one as strong as the first. We never had a chance." He paused as if weighing his words. "But I'm glad we lived to see what strength can build when it isn't used to destroy." The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant echo of recorded engines playing from a display. It sounded almost like the wind over Rechlin. Lawson closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could feel the vibrations of that first test flight, the raw power of the engine, the steady calm of a machine that never faltered. He smiled faintly and whispered, "The flying tank of America." When he stepped away, his reflection lingered on the polished surface, framed by the wings of the aircraft he once underestimated. As he walked toward the exit, the sound followed him, the deep, rhythmic thrum of the R-2800 engine recorded from decades earlier. It was steady, patient, unending. A sound that had once filled him with fear now carried something else: peace. In the end, it wasn't speed or elegance that won the air war. It was endurance, built into every bolt of the flying tank of America. Would you like me to write the epilogue and closing narration next? The reflective outro that ties all 6 parts together into a single cinematic conclusion? And now, I want to hear what you think. If you were standing beside Captain Lawson that day, watching the flying tank of America roar into the sky, would you have laughed or stayed silent? Type 0 if you think you might have doubted it, or 1 if you would have believed from the start. Your comment keeps history alive. And if stories like this move you, about the machines, the men, and the moments that changed our world, Make sure to subscribe and join us for the next chapter, because this is only one of many untold stories still waiting in the clouds.